"Get on the ground. Hands where I can see him." The shout cracked through the airport terminal like thunder. People froze mid-step, luggage dropped, kids clung to parents. All eyes turned to the center of the store. Malik Carter, a sharply dressed black man standing near gate 32, now surrounded by 3 TSA officers with hands on their weapons. I said, "Get on the ground." Another officer barked, his voice strained with adrenaline or maybe assumption. Malik raised his palms slowly, brows furrowed, confusion written all over his face. "What's going on? I'm down." The officer screamed, and without hesitation, they lunged. A woman in line gasped. A teenager instinctively pulled out their phone to record. But no one moved to help. Before Malik could get another word out, he was shoved to the floor. The cold tile met his cheek, and the weight of a knee bore down on his spine. People stepped aside as if he were contagious, as if his presence was dangerous. In the distance, a child asked, "Mom, what did he do?" No one had an answer, not even Malik. "I'm Detective Malik Carter," he said through gritted teeth, voice strained from the pressure on his back. "Badge is in my jacket pocket left side." He said it again, this time louder. "I'm law enforcement. Look in my jacket." The officer holding him down didn't flinch. Another one rummaged through Malik's backpack instead. Ignoring the simple instruction, the badge remained untouched. "So did the truth," I said. "We'll ask the questions," interrupted Officer Taylor, voice thick with judgment. 3 more times Malik repeated himself, but they acted like they couldn't hear him, like his voice didn't carry the same authority, like his words didn't matter. People watched, heard him identify himself, but no one stepped in. It wasn't just an arrest. It was erased. The knee pressed harder, grinding into Malik's back like it was personal. Each breath became a struggle. He winced but didn't cry out. Years of field work had taught him how to stay composed, even when everything in his body screamed. But this wasn't a takedown. This was degradation wrapped in protocol. "Why is no one doing anything?" A man muttered from the crowd. "Just stay out of it," his companion replied. "You don't want to get involved." Some watched, brows furrowed in unease. Others pulled out their phones but kept their distance, recording, not resisting. A woman whispered, "He said he's a detective. Did you hear him?" "I did," the man next to her said quietly. "They just don't care." Malik caught fragments of their voices. It hurt more than the physical force to silence, the inaction. The knowledge that even in a room full of witnesses, truth could be ignored so easily. The weight of that realization sank deeper than the knee ever could, as the officers roughly pulled Malik to his feet. Officer Taylor leaned in and muttered under his breath, "Drug mule, probably." The words weren't meant to be public, but they were loud enough for Malik to hear, loud enough for a few others to catch, too. Malik's jaw clenched, his fists tightened behind him, not because of the accusation, but because of how casual it was, how I practiced. Like this wasn't the first time Taylor had said something like that, like it was just part of the routine. "That's what this is," Malik said, barely able to contain the rage building inside. "You see a black man with a suit and a bag, and that's all it takes." Taylor didn't respond. He didn't need to. The smirk said enough. At that moment, Malik knew this wasn't just about mistaken identity. This was about something older, uglier, and far too familiar. They started dragging him toward a side hallway, away from the public, away from the cameras. Every step scraped at his dignity. Malik didn't resist. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't plead. He simply said, "Calm and steady, call Captain Jensen." The name dropped like a stone in still water. No shouting, no struggle. Just 5 quiet words, spoken like a code. One of the bystanders raised an eyebrow. "Who's Captain Jensen?" they whispered. The officers didn't respond, but something shifted briefly in their posture. A flicker of recognition, a hesitation. Malik saw it. He didn't smile, but something lit in his eyes. He knew the storm was coming, and this time it wasn't coming for him. Malik Carter grew up where sirens were louder than lullabies. South Philly, a place where kids learned to dodge judgment before they learned to drive. His mother, a nurse who never took sick days, raised him on discipline, dignity, and dreams. Too big for their 2-bedroom apartment. Malik wasn't supposed to wear a badge. He was supposed to be a statistic. But by 17, he had memorized the criminal code better than most rookies. His teachers doubted him. One counselor even said, "College might be a reach, Malik. Have you considered trade school?" But he reached anyway. Police academy, honor graduate, then detective. His first case solved in 2 weeks. First commendation buried behind someone else's name. That didn't stop him. Malik pressed forward, not for applause, but for the kids. Watching him the way he used to watch the officers who never looked his way. Every door he kicked open, every case he closed, wasn't just justice. It was proof that someone from his block could make it. He carried that with him. Even now, especially, now as strangers pressed him to the ground like none of it mattered. Inside the department, Malik became the guy who gets things done, but never the guy in charge. He trained younger officers who got promoted before him. He briefed task forces that barely acknowledged him. And at meetings, his suggestions only mattered once someone else repeated them louder. He wasn't loud, he was precise. That made people nervous. There was the time an assistant mistook him for a delivery guy. Another when a lieutenant said, "You're so articulate," like he'd never expected it. Malik smiled through it all. You don't make it to major crimes by snapping at every slight. Still, it added up. At home, his wife would ask, "Does it ever stop?" He'd answer, "It slows down when they need something." She didn't laugh. Neither did he. Malik had more arrests than any other detective in his division last year. No write-ups, no scandals, just stats. Still, they called him lucky, as if it wasn't earned, as if he hadn't bled for it. This trip wasn't for sun or rest. It was for change. Malik had been invited to speak at a national law enforcement conference, topic reform, diversity, and building trust between communities and the badge. For once, someone had asked him how to fix what broke people like him every day. He planned that speech like he planned his cases, tight, clear, with no wasted words. He was going to say what most wouldn't dare. Bias in law enforcement doesn't need a hood, it hides behind policies and polite smiles. He knew it might cost him something, but staying silent has always cost more. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that before he even reached the gate, he'd become the very case he was flying out to discuss. Before heading to the airport, Malik double-checked everything. Badge, visible, government-issued ID, right beside it. Dress shirt, tucked, shoes polished. He even rehearsed the phrase he'd say if stopped. Detective Carter, Philadelphia PD, traveling on official business. He walked into that terminal prepared. More than prepared, he was vigilant. Because being black and confident in public came with its own risks, especially in places with uniforms and power. So, when Officer Greg Taylor locked eyes with him, Malik felt it. That pause, that calculation, like the man was searching for a reason. "Excuse me, sir, I need you to step aside," Taylor said, even though Malik had cleared the scanner without issue. Malik's jaw clenched, but he kept it cool. "Detective Carter, I'm traveling for a law enforcement conference. My badge and ID are right. Step aside," and just like that, everything he'd prepared for didn't matter. Because Officer Taylor had already picked him. Greg Taylor looked Malik up and down with an unsettling smirk, then glanced at the badge hanging from Malik's neck. "This real?" he asked, the sarcasm dripping from his voice. Malik's jaw tightened. He didn't move, didn't let the question rattle him. He had dealt with much worse, but the audacity of it, it stung. "This is real," Malik replied calmly, his voice even, almost too composed. "Detective Carter, Philadelphia PD. I'm traveling for a conference on law enforcement reform." Taylor raised an eyebrow, his lips curling just enough to make the disdain clear. "Reform? Huh. Guess we need all the help we can get." Malik's heartbeat picked up, but his stance didn't waver. He was used to it, the judgment, the subtle digs, the suggestion that he didn't belong in the room. And yet, this time, it wasn't just about a detective badge. It was the badge of his skin. "I'm sure we can get this sorted," Malik said, keeping his tone professional. Taylor didn't move, his smirk never leaving his face. The tension hung thick in the air, and Malik could feel the sting of that question, louder than the noise of the airport around them. Without another word, Greg motioned Malik to step aside, and the process began. "This is a random security check," Taylor said, his voice flat, as if it was all just procedure. But as Malik glanced around, he noticed something. Taylor's eyes never left him. Two white men, both dressed in business suits and carrying oversized carry-ons, breezed through the security line without a second glance. No questions, no delays. But Malik, he was being held up for a random check. Malik's stomach tightened. He was no stranger to the way people moved around him like he was an anomaly or disruption. But seeing it unfold so blatantly here, in this sterile public space, felt different. This wasn't random. This was intentional. The agent gestured to Malik's carry-on bag with a forced cheerfulness. "Let's see what you've got here, sir." He complied, opening the bag with deliberate care, laying each item out: his laptop, his travel case, his clothes, nothing out of the ordinary. Taylor's eyes scanned the items with exaggerated suspicion, dragging the moment longer than necessary. Malik didn't say a word. His pride wouldn't let him. But the humiliation built quietly, the weight of it thickening with every glance Taylor cast toward him. This wasn't about safety. It was about sending a message. After what felt like hours, Malik was ushered into a small, cold room. The door slammed shut behind him with an echo that resonated deeper than just the sound. He was being isolated now, not for his safety, but for theirs. A tall officer, one who hadn't spoken to him before, moved to dump Malik's belongings on a table. His bag hit the surface with a clatter, the items scattering like they didn't matter. "Step over there," the officer barked, motioning to a metal chair. Malik obeyed, still silent, but his mind raced. What did they think they were going to find? What was this really about? The officer stood off to the side, not asking any questions yet, just waiting. Malik's breathing became shallow, every instinct telling him to fight the silence, but he held back. His eyes flickered to the corner of the room where a dog was, sniffing through his belongings, its handler barely acknowledging Malik's presence. Another officer entered. This one, a woman, whose gaze lingered on Malik with the same thinly veiled suspicion. "What are you carrying?" she asked. "You sure there's nothing you're not telling us?" His blood boiled, but he kept his composure. This wasn't about what he was carrying. This was about him being here. Then came the questions. Where? "Are you really going, detective? You sure you're not hiding something in that bag?" The implication was clear. Malik clenched his fists under the table. His entire life had been about proving himself only now. He was a suspect in a game that had already been rigged against him. Every question felt like a judgment, and they weren't asking for safety. They were asking because they could. Malik sat there, still as stone, every nerve in his body demanding release. His thoughts screamed, "This isn't random. It's not about security. It's about me." But he remained silent, knowing that any movement, any reaction, would be twisted against him. They didn't know what to do with him. He wasn't the kind of black man they expected. He wasn't the kind of black man who screamed or fought back. He was the kind who'd sit there with his dignity intact. No matter how small the space, he breathed deeply, his mind running through the mantra his mother had instilled in him long ago. Never let them see you break. He hadn't broken, not yet. But Malik knew this wasn't over. They hadn't asked the right questions yet. And somehow, he knew that this would change everything. The sharp bark of "Get Down" shattered the air as Greg Taylor lunged forward, grabbing Malik by the shoulder and forcing him to the ground. The echo of his voice was loud, too loud, slicing through the crowded terminal. Passengers froze. Some gasped. Others didn't even flinch. Malik's body hit the cold, unforgiving floor, the impact jarring his ribs. His hands were still raised, palms out, but the force of the sudden aggression made him stumble. He wasn't resisting. He wasn't fighting. He was just there, caught in a trap he couldn't see. "What the hell is this?" Malik's voice, controlled yet shaking, barely made it through. He had complied with every order, gone through every screening without protest. But now, without warning, he was being ambushed in front of everyone. No reason, no warning, just violence. Greg's hand was already on Malik's neck, pressing down harder than necessary, the weight of his body an unmistakable sign of force, not protocol. "Sir, what's going on?" A bystander shouted, his voice trembling. "He's a cop. He's a cop. Why are you doing this?" But Greg didn't care. His face twisted into an expression of pure authority, an expression designed to crush any ounce of resistance before it could rise. The tip had come through anonymous channels, verified, unsubstantiated, but it was enough for Greg to act. He didn't care about verification, about facts. He cared about control, and Malik. He was just another body to throw on the floor to prove that control. The airport terminal was in chaos. Malik lay face down on the floor, his body pinned under Greg's weight, his identity slipping further away with every passing second. Phones were out. Cameras pointed at him as if he were nothing more than a spectacle, another black man on the ground. "What's going on?" someone muttered. Another voice joined in. "This is bullshit. He's a cop, right?" A few people approached, voices rising in protest. A woman's voice cut through the noise. "This isn't right. He's a detective. What the hell's happening here?" But not everyone saw it that way. A man nearby, his face painted with indifference, spoke, up with a calmness that didn't match the scene. "Probably just a bad apple. Who knows? Maybe he's hiding something." The crowd's reaction was a stark contrast. Some tried to speak out, their words faltering against the weight of public opinion. Others, like the man in the suit, casually, justified the scene with coded language, as though it made sense to take a black man to the floor on suspicion alone. Malik didn't know whether to feel sick or just tired of this being the default. Tired of the weight of everybody's assumptions. Tired of feeling like he was always fighting against something invisible but powerful. The murmurs of the crowd mixed with the faint sound of clicking cameras. The scene wasn't just about Malik anymore, it was about how the world saw him. It was about perception, bias, and the systems that let this happen. Greg knelt on Malik's spine, pressing down harder, forcing his body further into the cold floor. Malik could barely breathe. His vision blurred slightly from the pressure, but he didn't let the discomfort show. The sound of his things being scattered across the floor, the sharp clink of his phone, his badge hitting the ground, the rattle of his laptop bag sent a ripple of humiliation through him. Each object that hit the ground wasn't just a personal possession. It was a piece of his dignity, his identity, his authority as a detective. Tossed aside like garbage, Malik's badge lay just out of reach, as if it had no value anymore, abandoned on the floor next to him. The glint of metal, once something he wore with pride, now felt like a cruel reminder of what had been stripped away from him. His hands were still pinned under his body, his wrists aching against the pressure. "Stop resisting," Greg barked, though Malik had never resisted. His voice was so calm it almost didn't make sense in the chaos, but it didn't matter. They didn't hear him. They didn't see him. "I'm not resisting," Malik muttered under his breath. He wasn't pleading. He wasn't begging for mercy. He was stating the truth. The officers surrounding him barely glanced at him, as if he were just another statistic to add to the day's numbers. Malik tried to gather what was left of his strength, his pride. He had never been more aware of how quickly a man's identity could be torn away. He had always thought he could protect it, but now it felt like there was nothing left. Greg finally stepped back, and the weight on Malik's back lifted just for a moment. As the cuffs clicked onto Malik's wrists, Greg leaned in close, his voice low but cruel. "Bet you're used to this, huh? Getting down on the ground like that? Probably. Happens every time, doesn't it?" Malik's heart raced, his entire body alive with anger, but he kept his gaze level. Greg thought he was winning. He thought the scene was over, but Malik had just reached his breaking point. "You have no idea," Malik whispered, his voice a thin thread of control. "You don't get to tell me how I feel." Malik's mind was already made up. He wasn't going to let this go. He wasn't going to let this define him. He reached into his pocket with his cuffed hands and pulled out his phone. "Captain Jensen," he said, his voice steady. "It's me. We need to talk." Now, the power was starting to shift. Malik wasn't just a victim anymore. He wasn't going to let this injustice go unanswered. His department, his family was about to know exactly what happened. The sound of distant sirens pierced the otherwise quiet parking lot of the airport. It was a stark contrast to the tense silence that had lingered after Malik's arrest. The quiet chaos began to shift as sleek SUVs, their sirens turned off, rolled in with controlled precision. The air around them grew heavy with anticipation, every set of eyes turning towards the approaching force. A collective unease rippled through the airport staff, their composure beginning to crack. Captain Jensen was here. "Where's my detective?" The sharp, commanding voice of Captain Jensen echoed through the halls as he stormed into the building. His arrival sent a visible shudder through the airport security team. It wasn't just his words, it was the weight of his presence, the way he carried authority in every step. He wasn't just a supervisor. He was a force to be reckoned with. The tension in the room thickened as Malik's colleagues, fellow officers, the area behind Jensen. One by one, they entered, their uniforms a stark contrast to the civilian workers around them. They knew exactly what was at stake, and they were here to reclaim control. The security personnel exchanged nervous glances. Their confidence began to waver, a crack in the facade of unquestionable authority. Malik was no longer alone. This was no longer just a case of mistaken identity or an isolated incident. This was something bigger. Captain Jensen's voice cut through the murmurs. "Where is Officer Malik?" Now, the shift in power was palpable. Jensen's presence in the room had already begun to unravel the authority that had held Malik down by the time Jensen's voice rang out across the airport. Malik's story had already begun to spread far beyond these walls. A bystander, standing helpless in the corner during the arrest, had captured every moment on their phone. The video was already making waves online, shared by hundreds, and soon thousands. Within minutes, the view count surged to over 20K, then 50K. The words "airport security arrests black detective" without reason flashed across the screen of countless phones, reaching people from all walks of life. The angry comments poured in, each post a mix of disbelief, outrage, and support for Malik. The silent crowd that stood by, unsure or too afraid to speak up, was no longer voiceless. They didn't have to. The video had done what the crowd had failed to do, amplified the injustice. In a world where every moment was recorded, racism could no longer hide in the shadows. It was exposed to the world. "Malik, we see you." One comment read, "We won't let this go." The world had seen the truth, and the public outrage that followed was a force in its own right. Now, it wasn't just Captain Jensen demanding was everyone who had witnessed the injustice from the comfort of their own homes. The cold, sterile back room where Malik was held felt like the last place his humanity should have been stripped away. Cuffed and bruised, Malik sat slumped on the floor, his body trembling slightly from the aftermath of the altercation. He'd never imagined that a routine stop at the airport would turn into something like this. But then the door swung open. "Get those off him, now." Captain Jensen's voice held no room for argument as he entered, the weight of his presence once again commanding the space. His team quickly moved to uncuff Malik, their hands steady and professional as they removed the cold metal from around his wrists. Every click of the cuffs being undone felt like the reawakening of Malik's dignity. It wasn't just his physical freedom that was being restored, it was his sense of self. His badge, his identity as an officer, was coming back to him in this simple act. Jensen knelt beside Malik, his eyes softening for the first time since his arrival. The anger had not faded from his voice, but there was a flicker of understanding in his gaze. "You're not alone, Malik." Malik's breath hitched, his body still feeling the effects of the humiliation. He looked up at Jensen, his voice barely a whisper. "I've never felt this powerless before." The silent trauma of the moment wasn't lost on Jensen. There was a heavy weight to Malik's words. His colleagues, the officers who knew him well, knew the strength he carried. But even the strongest had their breaking point. As Malik stood shakily, his colleagues surrounded him, their faces full of empathy, but also a shared fire to right this wrong. This was more than a department issue now. It was personal. Greg, who had been standing off to the side, still attempting to justify his actions, stepped forward. He was sweating, his previously confident demeanor now crumbling under the weight of the situation. "I was just following Protocol, he muttered, his voice faltering. Jensen turned sharply to face him, his eyes sharp, cutting through the lies Greg had clung to. No, what you did was profiling. Your profile is racism, Greg. You can't hide behind rules when it's clear you never saw Malik as an officer. You saw him as a threat because of the color of his skin. Greg opened his mouth, but no words came out. The truth had been laid bare, and it was too much to deny. Jensen's words hit harder than any physical punishment. They weren't just words, they were the beginning of a reckoning, a shift in the power dynamic, and for Greg, a moment of truth that could never be. Undone, Malik was no longer a victim at this moment. With every word spoken by Captain Jensen, his dignity was being restored, and the fight for justice was just beginning. The tension between them was palpable. What had started as a moment of humiliation for Malik was now evolving into a moment of reckoning for Greg. The weight of accountability was shifting from the wronged to the wrongdoer. The game had changed. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full of possibility. The next steps were clear, and the power had shifted. But the story was far from over. The fallout was swift. Within hours of the viral video reaching millions, the department had no choice but to act. Greg's actions had gone beyond personal misconduct. They had undermined the very integrity of the system he swore to protect. Greg's been terminated. Captain Jensen's voice echoed through the department, a bitter sense of justice in his words. It wasn't just a consequence for Greg, it was a statement. An internal memo had been circulated. The investigation was active, and every officer who had even remotely participated in the escalation of that day would be questioned. Malik stood by, silently absorbing the impact of those words. He didn't need to speak to feel the weight of the department's response. The message was clear. Racism would no longer be tolerated, not within these walls. For Malik, though, it wasn't about Greg's punishment. It was about what the punishment represented. Accountability, real accountability, was in motion. By the time the department had announced Greg's termination, the video had exploded across social media. The numbers were staggering 3 million views in 24 hours. The video was everywhere, shared across platforms, discussed by people from every corner of the country. In a world where digital voices were often drowned out by noise, this video had become a megaphone for justice. The comments poured in, each one louder than the last. This is what racism looks like in the real world. He was treated like this because of the color of his skin. It wasn't just a viral moment, it was a turning point. People everywhere were forced to confront what they had seen. The outrage was undeniable. The world had witnessed this injustice, and now the world was demanding answers. Malik's ordeal had ignited something far larger than any one man or moment. It was a collective reckoning. When Malik stepped back into the precinct, the room was filled with applause. Officers stood, clapping as he entered, their faces a mix of respect and solidarity. His colleagues rallied behind him, their support undeniable. But the applause, however loud, couldn't drown out the thoughts racing in Malik's mind. He appreciated the gesture, but it didn't erase the scars left by this ordeal. As he nodded to his colleagues, his mind drifted, remembering the countless times he had walked into this same precinct unnoticed. He had once been a silent part of the system, the quiet observer of countless injustices. But today, things were different. The applause didn't come from nowhere, came because his actions had forced people to see what they'd long ignored. Still, as the claps continued, Malik knew the applause was fleeting. The trauma, the years of systemic racism he'd experienced, would never be silenced by a few moments of recognition. Not yet. Standing before a crowd of reporters, Malik adjusted the mic in front of him. He wasn't there to make excuses. He wasn't there to placate anyone's need for a tidy resolution. When the badge doesn't protect you, he began, his voice steady, you realize that the system you've given your life to can sometimes be your worst enemy. The room fell silent, every eye trained on him. Malik spoke, not just for himself, but for every officer, every citizen who had ever felt the sting of racial profiling. The truth is, he continued, we've all been taught to believe that the badge protects us from the very things it often perpetuates. But the truth is, racism doesn't disappear just because we wear a uniform. It hides in our biases, in our policies, in our silence. His words hung in the air. The weight of his speech settled over the crowd. This wasn't a moment for applause. It was a moment for reckoning. The ripple effect was immediate. TSA began to implement reforms aimed at addressing racial profiling, and a federal investigation was launched. The conversation that Malik's actions had sparked wasn't dying. It was growing. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't be fixed overnight, but the changes had begun. Malik's voice had broken the silence, and the institution, slowly but surely, was responding. There was still work to do, still miles to go before justice was truly equal for everyone. But for the first time in a long time, Malik could see the glimmer of change. It was small, but it was meaningful. The fight wasn't over, but it had taken a crucial step forward. Imagine you're there, witnessing something like this unfold. A black detective, in uniform, being treated like a criminal, arrested without cause. What would you do? Would you stand by and watch, or would you speak up, even when it feels like it's too late? Think about it. When injustice happens right in front of us, our response could change everything. Maybe you've seen it happen before. Perhaps you've been on the receiving end of racial profiling yourself. It might have been subtle, or maybe it was blatant. Whatever the case, you're not alone. Share your story in the comments below. Your voice matters, and together, we can create a community where these experiences aren't ignored, they're heard, understood, and acted upon. This isn't just a story, it's a call to action. Like, comment, and share to keep the conversation going. Let's use our collective power to amplify voices that need to be heard. Don't let this just be a video that you watch, let it be a spark for change. Together, we can make a difference.